welcome. I'm Ramesh Ramachandran, and you're watching a special broadcast here on DD India. And I have with me a very special guest, Ambassador John Bolton of the United States. Ambassador Bolton, welcome to DD India.
Well, glad to be with you. Thank you very much for having me.
Now, Ambassador Bolton needs no introduction, but just for the benefit of viewers who might not be familiar with him, Ambassador Bolton is a former U.S. National Security Advisor. He was the NSA between 2018 and 19, more specifically between April 2018 and September 2019. He's also held many other posts in his career, including the post of the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations in New York between 2005 and 2006. And Ambassador Bolton has authored 3 books. His first book is titled Surrender Not an Option, Defending America at the United Nations and Abroad, that was published in 2007. His second book is titled How Barack Obama is Endangering Our National Sovereignty, published in 2010. And most recently, his book titled The Room Where It Happened, a White House Memoir. Ambassador Bolton, thank you once again for your time. Now, you've been asked many questions about your book, The Room Where It Happened, but I want to ask you about something which you've not probably mentioned as much as one would have liked to in your book, and that has to do with India or South Asia in particular. Now, India figures in about only 10 pages in your book, twice along with China, twice along with Pakistan, twice along with Iran oil, and once each on the issues of trade, non-proliferation, the S-400 missile defense systems from Russia, and President Trump's comment on Modi.
Well, it's a very fair question, and I think what I tried to write about in the book was what President Trump spent his time on in the national security space, and therefore what I spent my time on. I think the relatively small amount of discussion of India reflects, from the U.S. point of view, a huge missed opportunity. And I think that's because it didn't show up on the president's radar screen, except insofar as Prime Minister Modi's population in the Indian American community in the United States might help President Trump for his re-election campaign in November. But I think in geostrategic terms, the U.S.-India bilateral relationship is going to be one of the most important for the U.S. in the 21st century. I think China, from the U.S. perspective, is the existential threat potentially of the 21st century. It's not to say there aren't other threats and adversaries out there. There certainly are. But the other main player on the world scene for the rest of the century will be India. And the relationship, I hope, between the U.S. and India, two democracies with many common values and an increasingly shared heritage. You know, America is a country where people have immigrated from all over the world. I'm Scotch-Irish myself. There are primarily there are relationships all over the world. This is perfectly natural in America. So attention to India, I think, will inevitably grow. But again, geopolitically, this is critical. There are a lot of issues that need to be discussed between the U.S. and India, and had, I think, the president paid more time to them, it would have been reflected in the book. I think whoever's elected president in November, whether Trump is reelected or Biden, the person who writes the counterpart to my memoirs for that administration will spend a lot more time on India.
Right. Ambassador Bolton, now we are speaking on the 1st of July, and this date is important for several counts. 1st July was the tentative deadline for Israel to annex parts of West Bank. That has been delayed, we are told. 1st July is also the day when Russia voted in a referendum to elect and have President Putin for as leader for the next several years, including till 2036. And most recently, we heard from the U.S., from the FCC of the U.S., which has designated Huawei and ZTE as threats, as posing threats to U.S. national security. Also, Ambassador Bolton, 1st July 2002 was the date when the ICC treaty came into force. And you have been quoted as saying that the American decision to quit the ICC on 6th of May 2002 is quote unquote the happiest moment of my political career. 18 years on, Ambassador Bolton, do you still believe that was the happiest moment of your career?
Yes, look, the ICC, I think, is an illegitimate institution. I don't think it's subject to democratic control, not by any of its members or by any mechanism that's built into the treaty. I think it's true for India. It's certainly true for the United States. I'll just speak about the United States. We are very strongly committed to prevent genocide, to avoid human rights violations, to fight according to the laws of war, and if and when Americans abuse their own training and conduct and our standards, the United States is perfectly competent to prosecute them, and we will do that, and we have done that. What we don't need is a free-floating international court and prosecutor to second-guess the decisions made by democratically elected governments in the United States. That's not to say, therefore, that we ignore the standards that we live by. Our point is we not only live by them, we have to be responsible to ourselves and our posterity.
Would you then not say, Ambassador Bolton, that there could have been many more happy moments in your career since then? For instance, why not the US pull off the Iran nuclear deal in 2018? Why not the killing of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi in October 19?
Well, Baghdadi and Soleimani were happy moments. I was out of the government at that point, so I'm in my categorization. I'm just looking during my government service. I will say that withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal was a very happy day too. I think there have been successes, to be sure. I try and recount some of them in my book, In the Room Where It Happened, during my time in the Trump administration. But it's a very challenging world. You know, I think we all felt in 1991, when the Soviet Union disintegrated, when communism in Russia and Europe essentially collapsed, that we had moved into a different period of history, and it would be peaceful and could be dominated by economic concerns, and everything would work out fine. Turned out that wasn't true. It was, I think, misguided optimism. We live in a world of challenges. We've got the strategic threats of Russia and China. We've got the threats of proliferation by Iran, North Korea in the nuclear, chemical, and biological field. We've got the threats of international terrorism. So the Cold War was a gravely dangerous period, but it was static because of the standoff in nuclear terms between the Soviet Union and the U.S. It's a much more chaotic world that we live in now, with many more challenges.
Indeed. Ambassador Bolton, I want us to dwell a bit, if you will, on China. Now, you say that the U.S. was late to wake up to the threats posed by China in the cyberspace on cybersecurity. Now, how serious a threat is China today as we speak, especially given the Chinese entities, Huawei and ZTE, being designated as security threats by the US FCC?
Yeah. These two entities are not commercial telecommunications firms. They are arms of the Chinese state. They are part of the effort to gain control of the economic space around the world, part of the Belt and Road Initiative. I have to give the Chinese government credit. They think in enormously long periods of time. Unlike Americans, we tend to be very, very conscious of quarterly reports and that sort of thing. This is a long-term strategy. I think that much of the rest of the world has made two mistakes about China over the past 30 or 40 years, looking back at Deng Xiaoping abandoning many communist principles. We believed first that the economic freedom and growth that took place in China would make it abide by the rules of the international economic order. That has turned out not to be true. They steal intellectual property, they engage in forced technology transfers, engage in a range of unacceptable behavior. That's one. Two, I think we believed that as China became more prosperous, that representative government would also spread from village elections to provincial elections to national elections. That has turned out not to be true. Xi Jinping is the most powerful Chinese leader since Mao Zedong. There's no sign of the spread of representative government. So on these two basic mistakes, a lot of policy has been built. That policy needs to be re-examined.
You spoke about Xi Jinping, Ambassador Bolton. So if I can quote you from your book about the Xi Jinping-Donald Trump relationship, you say about Xi Jinping, for Xi Jinping, personal relationships or any sort did not get in the way of his advancing Chinese interests, unquote. And you say about President Trump that he had trouble divorcing the personal from the official. How would you characterize these two gentlemen, Xi Jinping and President Trump, from your vantage, Ambassador Bolton?
Well, Xi Jinping obviously is an authoritarian leader. He represents a united point of view, and I think it's enforced within the Chinese government and society. I think his moves are very coldly calculated to advance Chinese national interest. I'm not being critical when I say that. I admire it in a sense. He knows exactly what he's doing. Whereas with President Trump, it's much more ad hoc. It's much more about the personal rapport between the two leaders. It's much more about trade. That is the focus of his discussions with many countries. It was in many meetings with Prime Minister Modi, almost to the exclusion of other, in my view, more strategic questions. And I think the focus of President Trump on getting reelected on November the 3rd shone through in his conversations with Xi and many other leaders as well.
Indeed. And talking about President Xi Jinping in particular, Ambassador Bolton, you referred to the One China policy, the one country, two systems formula of China in your book, and you say in one of the chapters that Xi Jinping personally took decisions vis-a-vis Hong Kong. Now, we've seen that happen in many countries, many other countries in China's neighborhood, including India recently, given the standoff between Indian and Chinese troops in northern part of India. How would you assess China's so-called peaceful rise or peaceful development? Is it a thing of the past?
Well, I think the idea of China engaging in a peaceful rise and becoming a responsible stakeholder in world affairs, those are two of the buzz phrases we all know, were based on the analysis that economic growth would make China play by the rules and would make it more democratic. So I don't think the rise has been peaceful, and I don't think it's a responsible stakeholder. China is effectively seizing control of the South China Sea. It's declared it annexed as a province. You know, in the Middle East, people talk about facts on the ground. In the South China Sea, they are literally creating the ground upon which they're building the facts, military bases. China has one of the world's largest, maybe the largest, offensive cyber warfare program. It's got area denial and anti-access weapons to push the U.S. Navy out of the Western Pacific. It's expanding its ballistic missile and nuclear weapons capabilities, on and on and on, which is why when you see a border clash, as we recently did between India and China, this sort of behavior, I think, worries everybody on China's periphery, and it worries the United States because there are key interests involved for us in all of the countries on that periphery.
Indeed. The other pressing issue facing the world today, Ambassador Bolton, is the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, on this particular issue, you say, and I quote here, there are two chilling conclusions. First, we must do everything possible to ensure that China and its contemporaneous disinformation campaign about the origin of the virus will not succeed in proving that the big lie technique is alive and well in the 21st century. We must tell the truth about China's behavior, which Trump has consistently loathed to do, or we will suffer the consequences and the risk well into the future, unquote. Your thoughts, Ambassador Bolton, on the origin and spread of the COVID-19 pandemic and an attempt by some countries, including the US and Australia for the matter, to institute an investigation into all of it?
Yeah, I think this is very important. I don't think there's any doubt that beginning in January, maybe beginning as far back as mid-November, according to the South China Morning Post, when the first case was uncovered of what we now call COVID-19, that China engaged in an extensive disinformation campaign around the world. It locked down free news reporting inside China. I don't think to this day we really know the extent of the effects inside China. the statistics comparing, let's say, the spread of the disease in the U.S. and Europe and Latin America, now in India and elsewhere in the world, make it look as though it's completely solved in China. It's impossible to believe that. We don't know the economic impact in China. We also know this, and I'm not saying I know what the exact cause of the disease was. That's part of what we need to find out. But any country that has or aspires to have biological weapons can look at the response of the whole world, which has been inadequate in almost every country, and conclude you don't need nuclear weapons to be a superpower if you've got biological weapons. And this is something, China's research on biological weapons could be the most extensive in the world, and I think as they look around, this is something that should chill all of us. So a country that really wanted to get to the bottom of this would have no fear in opening up to epidemiologists and physicians. I'm not talking about intelligence agencies. I'm talking about scientists. And let's all get to the bottom of it. That's been the opposite of China's approach.
Mr. Bolton, you devote a lot of pages in your book to the issue of terrorism in general and the ISIS in particular in relation to Syria and other parts of the world. Now, my question to you is this, now the ISIS may have been defeated physically on the ground, they might be on the retreat, but the ideology remains as virulent as ever, Ambassador Bolton. So have you seen the back of the ISIS yet?
No, I don't think so, and I don't think we've seen the back of international terrorism from these radical, politicized Islamicists. The ISIS territorial caliphate has been eliminated. I think that's a significant victory, but ISIS remains a powerful force in Syria and Iraq and in Afghanistan, where I think the Taliban remain as dangerous as they've ever been. I don't think they're going to follow through on the peace deal that they've negotiated. I don't think they have any intention of honoring that with respect to the government of Afghanistan. And I think the harboring of terrorists, whether they're ISIS or Al-Qaeda or others, remains a severe problem. You know, this is like Europe after World War I, where communists and anarchists and socialists, it's not like you have a membership card that says I'm an ISIS member today and an Al-Qaeda member tomorrow. The terrorist threat is complex. It's changing all the time. It's very, very real. I think you were right to say it's just as virulent today as it has been in decades.
Indeed. You spoke about the Taliban and Afghanistan, Ambassador Bolton, which gives me a perfect segue into my next question. There are many other terror outfits operating in South Asia, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, and at the same time we're seeing the American side deal directly with the Taliban in Afghanistan. What's your sense of the talks with the Taliban? Are the Taliban's, are they trustworthy? Are they reliable? Can they be taken at face value going forward as well?
Well, I was skeptical of having the talks from the beginning. I thought there was no harm in it initially. I write about this in the book because I didn't think the talks would succeed. But I think if Taliban perceives that under President Trump, the United States is inevitably going to withdraw its forces, they can certainly take advantage of that and make deals along the way. There's a saying the Taliban had referring to Americans. They say, "You have the watches, we have the time." It's a very profound insight on the part of the Taliban. We've put a lot of effort into Afghanistan, and to see that all disappear, I think would be a great tragedy, and I think would be destabilizing in South Asia and the other side in the Middle East as well.
Indeed. And talking about the Afghan peace talks, Ambassador Bolton, we've seen American side engage with Pakistan in particular. That's because of the links they have with the Taliban and other groups operating in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Is Pakistan, in your estimation, a part of the problem or the solution?
Well, it's part of both. It certainly could be part of the solution. A friend of mine who is an expert in Pakistan and Afghan affairs once said that Pakistan's government was the only government he had ever seen that was composed simultaneously of arsonists and firefighters, some of whom were the same people. And I think the ISI's influence on radicals in Afghanistan for years has been well known, going back to the days of the Soviet invasion. I honestly don't think it's ultimately in the long-term interest of Pakistan to have inspired these terrorists who commit crimes and and the like in India and within their own country and elsewhere around the world. There's no question of good terrorists and bad terrorists. This is something that threatens all of us, and it threatens the legitimate, stable, secure, secular part of Pakistan as well.
In your book, Ambassador Bolton, you refer to the 2017 August speech by President Trump outlining his new South Asia strategy. And you say that it's an eminently forgettable speech. In your words, it is that stupid speech. And you also say that Trump was bitter whenever his 2017 speech came up. In hindsight, Ambassador Bolton, could the President Trump's government or administration have done things differently in Afghanistan?
Well, it was President Trump who called it that stupid speech, even though he was the one who gave it because of the consequences in Afghanistan. And he blamed the military, basically, for not carrying it through. But, you know, this is a problem for President Trump, and I write a number of incidents to that effect in the book, that he has trouble taking responsibility for his own decisions. We have a phrase, we say, you need to own that decision. And the president never wanted to own the decisions reflected in the speech that you referred to. I think there were enormous lost opportunities in South Asia. It's obviously much bigger than just Afghanistan and Pakistan. I think working through the complexities of the U.S.-India relationship needs a higher priority. It's not going to be entirely easy. You mentioned a moment ago the question of the S-400 purchase from Russia. This is a huge problem for the United States. It's a huge problem in our relationship with Turkey and with other countries. I think the future of India's military capability is going to be in large part indigenous to India. I think that you will build that capability up. I think you will need to rely less on purchases from Russia. But there are some weapon systems that for the foreseeable future you'll want to purchase from overseas, as many other countries do. I'd like to see the connection with Russia certainly lessened dramatically, and others. It's not just the U.S., France, Sweden, many other countries. I think this is how to reshape India's view of the world from Cold War days, which we're all still evolving from, into a view that looks at the current threats and the threats of the 21st century.
And if I can take you back a couple of decades, Ambassador Bolton, President George W. Bush coined this phrase, the axis of evil, and you appended to that statement of his by adding a few more countries. Now, many in South Asia wonder there are many other countries that qualify as state sponsors of terror. If you go by your definition of the axis of evil, why not, for instance, add countries such as Pakistan? What would you say to those people?
Well, this has been a very difficult relationship for the U.S. to manage for many, many years. It's been complicated by the development of nuclear weapon systems there, and by the close connection in your huge part of the world with China, India, Russia, and Pakistan all locked close together there. I think one of the achievements of the George W. Bush administration was to de-link India and Pakistan for years, for decades. Sort of one was up in U.S. eyes and the other was down. That was a mistake from our point of view. It was a mistake, I think, especially from India's point of view. And I think it's important that we maintain that. That said, how you deal with this incredibly large country remains difficult for us to see. I think if you cast them aside entirely, the risk is that China simply subsumes them and they become almost a satellite of China. I don't think that would be positive for the U.S. or for India. So I don't have a very good answer to your question, because I think it's something, in many cases, you have to grit your teeth about actions they've taken. The recent statements by the Prime Minister about Osama bin Laden have got a lot of attention in the United States. I wish he hadn't said that, obviously, because of the signal it sends to the other terrorists out there. But this is just something we have to work on. And what that means, by the way, is for the U.S. president has to pay more sustained attention to it.
Absolutely. Ambassador Bolton, President Obama spoke about a pivot and rebalance to Asia. President Trump has articulated his so-called Indo-Pacific strategy. Now, given China's proclivity for antagonizing every country in its neighborhood, including India. Do you see the salience of the Quad going up in the near future? For instance, maybe elevating the quadrilateral to a more political level?
Yeah, I think the concept of the free and open Indo-Pacific is very important. I think the linkage of Indo and Pacific is important. I don't think the Obama pivot was ever going to work. The United States doesn't have an option to pivot anywhere. We are everywhere, and we need to pay more attention in many parts of the world. But I think we've seen a lot of very important developments over the past 10 years. I think, for example, Japanese-Indian bilateral discussions have been incredibly significant. We've had trilateral meetings among the leaders, the Australians, the Singaporeans, others have come into this. I think the potential is enormous. This is not anti-China, unless the Chinese take it that way. This is free and open Indo-Pacific region means exactly what it says. It's an excellent ideal to strive for. There's a lot of work. It's a bumper sticker now. There's a lot of work to make it happen, but I think if we commit to it, we can make it work.
Just a quick follow-up on China's Belt and Road Initiative, Ambassador Bolton. In hindsight, given the fact that you watched China from very close quarters during your stint at the White House, with the benefit of hindsight, you think countries around the world, including Africa, other parts of Asia, did not read the BRI correctly?
I think that's exactly right. They did not read it correctly. They didn't read the fine print in some of the agreements that they signed. We've given this a name ourselves. It's debt diplomacy, that many countries in Africa and Asia sign up to what look to be favorable terms, and then they can't escape. Sri Lanka, for example, has enormous problems already in that regard.
Right. And one last question towards the end of this conversation, Ambassador Bolton. You speak about, you claim that you have a record and support on multilateral issues, but you say you prefer unilateralism. Now, how do we reconcile the two?
Well, I think the U.S. should base its policies on what it thinks is in the best interest of the United States. I think that's what India bases its policies on. So I don't prefer unilateralism to multilateralism. Those are just tools. It's like saying, do you prefer a knife or a fork? Well, it depends on what you're using it for.
And any regrets at all, Ambassador Bolton, looking back at your long and distinguished career, something that would have stayed with you and you regret doing or not doing?
Well, I'm sure I made more than my share of mistakes over the years. I try and reflect on some of them in the book. I think participating with Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush in the defeat of Soviet communism was a huge historic significance, really the end of the Third World War of the 20th century.
All right, on that one, Ambassador Bolton, thank you so much for making time to speak to us at DD India. Appreciate it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it.
And that's a wrap on this special broadcast. But news continues here on DD India. You can catch all the latest updates on our social media, mobile and digital platforms. Thanks for watching. Bye.